huge thank you to our newest patrons, Queso and Antonio. Your support helps videos like this become possible. Patreon supporters this month can look forward to 2 commander decks dedicated to the characters we talk about in this video, so check out the link in the description. With that said, let's get into the video. Welcome to Bloomburrow, a plane which, much like Lorwyn, stands to be unique as it has no humans. But while Lorwyn focused on tribes like Kithkin, giants, and fairies, Bloomburrow feels more like a Winnie the Pooh story, featuring talking animals like rabbits, otters, frogs, and most importantly, bringing more squirrels into the game. However, all is not safe and secure in this world of courageous critters, as the earth-shaking Calamity Beasts have once again risen to wreak disaster upon the plane. But these aren't the only threats to Bloomburrow, as planeswalkers, dragons, and corruption make their way to the plane as well. And this is where our story begins. Part 1. Calamity comes to the valley. Helga was a frog folk who wore a perpetually nervous smile and a belief that she was insignificant and unspectacular. One morning, she sat sketching in her journal at the edge of the shore, hoping to find clarity and calm to save her from her own thoughts. She wouldn't be alone long though, as Neris the rabbit folk popped up behind her and tapped her on her shoulder. Helga yelped in fear as she jumped into the air and stumbled back onto the ground. Neris had arrived to check on Helga and see if she had completed her village chores. However, Helga had been sent away after ruining yet another batch of medicine. Hearing that Helga had made yet another mistake in a long line of mistakes, Neris mentioned that her grandparents had always coddled her, and now that they're dead, she shouldn't be wasting her life drawing or staring into the scrying pool, adding that she needed to live her life in the here and now rather than trying to surmise the future. Helga pushed back lightly, saying that looking to possible futures can help people make better choices in the present. But Neris simply brushed this off and said that he hopes her future will involve more work and less cloud gazing. And Neris wasn't the only one who felt this way. In fact, the entire village saw the world in the same light. The otter folk fished in the streams, the rabbit folk farmed for crops. It was only Helga who seemed to struggle to find her place. Even when given the opportunity to learn magic under King Glarb, she had found nothing but disappointment. The only solace that she had was in her art, but even that brought her anxiety. Lately, the image she had been working on was of a vision she had. A vision which was eerily similar to one of the Calamity Beasts she had seen in King Glarb's library, the Sunhawk. Her drawing was that of a beast so terrifying that she could never have thought of it herself. And so she believed it to be a vision of the future and wanted to bring it to the village's frog folk augur. In the past, the augur had always dismissed her visions as she hadn't completed her training, but this time she simply had to make him believe her. However, Helga never got the chance. As she marched towards her destination, Helga began to hear a deep ringing sound that spread across the fields. And sure enough, out in the distance, there was a mousefolk frantically striking the warning bell. Helga was too late. Far above her, a massive shadow was being cast that seemed to soar and circle above. A beautiful but terrible beast with wings as wide as the branches of an oak tree crossed the sky as a deep, velvety night followed in its wake and cut through the bright blue day like scissors cutting through cloth to reveal a starry black sky. This was Maha, the night owl. The animal folk of the village screamed and croaked in fear as a flurry of wings ripped across their field. As Maha flew, there was perfect silence, with only the sound of buildings splintering in her path to disrupt it. As the animal folk were forced to run from her, they were lost in the chaos, with Helga running until the world faded and time seemed to shatter around her. She would continue like this until the ground gave way beneath her, and she dropped off the edge of an embankment and landed in Pond Creek. By now, the entire sky had gone black, moonless and filled with unfamiliar stars. Helga wondered to herself if she should follow the creek to find safety with the other villagers after the Night Owl's rampage ended, or if she should head to the next village to warn them of the impending attack. She steeled her resolve, mustered her courage, and with her remaining strength, she decided to trudge forward to the next village. Meanwhile, a mousefolk named Mabel stood outside of her home in Goodhill, stirring batter as her children played around her. They were getting ready to celebrate Mabel's birthday, and up until this point, it had been wonderful. Sunny but not too warm, a light breeze that ruffled their fur. It was everything Mabel could have wished for. However, no party is complete without the addition of at least one person you wish wasn't there, and this leads us to Oliver. Oliver was a rabbit folk and the mayor of Goodhill. But as they spoke, Mabel would imagine them crossing swords in a duel. He mentioned how Silver the Bard was planning to share the story of the Order of the Holy Leaf, and use this as an excuse to ask to see the ancient relic which Mabel had tucked away. However, as always, Mabel refused him. Even after Oliver was subdued, the birthday festivities would need to be put on hold though, as a weasel folk named Jennifer arrived in a panic. She explained that there was a stranger in Pond Creek who didn't look very well. Hearing this, Mabel grabbed her rapier and called out to her husband Clem, saying that she would be back just as soon as she checked things out. She rushed towards the stranger as fast as her tiny legs could carry her, and of course, when she finally reached Pond Creek, she found a pale green frog covered in mud and completely exhausted. Despite her condition, Helga managed to squeak out a plea for help against the attacking Calamity Beast before passing out. Mabel decided to take Helga to her home to keep her safe until she woke up. However, until she came to, there was nothing to be done except wait and hope that they weren't next. Finally, far from the events of Bloomburrow, Ral Zarek was returning to Ravnica from Thunder Junction. The Planeswalker was obsessed with only a single thought. Jace Beleren is alive, and he needs to be killed. Up until recently, Jace had been assumed dead after the Phyrexian invasion, but with the reveal that he had simply been masquerading as Ashiok, everything changed. Ral's husband Tomik tried to speak sense to him, explaining that he simply wanted to know why Jace had abandoned them. And so with a calmer head, the next day Ral would travel to the Wanderer, seeking help in finding Jace. However, the Wanderer explained that she was unable to help since she had lost her connection to the Blind Eternities. Instead, she suggested that he head back to the last location that he had seen Jace and try to open up his soul to sense where he might have gone. And so Ral returned to Thunder Junction, cleared his mind, and searched for the essence of Jace. At first, he could only pick up the smell of dust and metal in the air, but then another power brushed against his own. A smudged hint of green at the end of an aether trail. As he focused on this feeling, the greenness bloomed like a flower. Ral closed his eyes and leaned into that feeling, following it into the Blind Eternities and emerging in a field of flowers. When he began looking around, it would only be a moment before he started to ask questions. What is this plane? Where is Jace? And most pressingly, what happened to me? As Ral examined himself, he noticed he was covered in fur. He had grown whiskers and suddenly a tail. The planeswalker Ral Zarek had been reduced to an otter. Part 2. An Expected Party. As Helga slept, she dreamt of the night owl, of destruction, fire, smoke, and screaming. However, the homes in this dream were unfamiliar to her. The scene would shift from the forest to the pond, jumping from location to location, but in each new place, her attention was always drawn to a weasel folk in a red hood with a scar over his eye. As she came to, she was met with laughter and voices from the next room over. Soon, Mabel would enter with her husband Clem, and of course, Oliver. Helga managed to share the story of the destruction of Pondside through small croaks. However, despite her best efforts to convince them, the group was left unsure of what to make of this story. Everyone returned to Mabel's party, and Oliver begins telling the guests that there is nothing to worry about because the Calamity Beasts were all coming on schedule. It was the natural order for them to stop in, to shift the seasons, and then to pass along. However, Helga knew the truth. Animal folk had learned magic to protect themselves from predators who ravaged their lands with blizzards, wildfires, and plagues. It was only with this magic and the burning might of a sword called Cragflame that the beasts had been driven away by heroes in the past. Thinking of these Calamity Beasts, Helga was racked with guilt about having left her home to one of these predators. She didn't know what she could have done, but she felt terrible over having done nothing. It was Mabel who ultimately calmed her nerves by explaining that there is always something more which we want to do, but telling her to recognize that neither of them are the linchpin that holds the universe in place, and that's just something they need to accept. Unlike everyone else, Mabel truly believed in Helga's story. So much so that she even planned to travel to Pondside to help, though she knew that she couldn't make it on her own. So Mabel tells Clem that she knows she has to go, but that she doesn't want to leave him and the children behind. But Clem just laughs it off and says that it's nothing to worry about. After all, he should be able to manage the kids for at least a few hours without her. With that, Mabel heads into the attic to retrieve the ancient relic that Oliver had been so interested in. Now was finally the time to take it out. Mabel pulled away a sheet covering an heirloom which her mother had passed down to her, a sword which once belonged to a hero known as Lily of the Valley. It had been forged from the fang of the wildfire wolf that had almost destroyed Bloomburrow years ago. This was Cragflame. As Mabel lifted the sword, a rush of magic flowed through her. It was a feeling like stepping into the sunshine after resting in the shade. That night at her party, guests gathered around to celebrate the woman who had spent her younger life as an adventurer and was now a mother, baker, and gardener who had earned the admiration and envy of all of those in Goodhill. But when it came time for Mabel to give her speech, she was unsure of what she really wanted to say. However, when she saw Helga, it quickly dawned on her that there was something she needed to say. Mabel couldn't imagine herself, or worse, her family, having to go through the tragedy that Helga just had. And so she spoke to the crowd. She told them that she didn't see herself any more brave than anyone else there. After all, bravery doesn't always mean climbing mountains or fighting bandits. Their town came together in times of hardship and need, and that was already plenty proof of their bravery as it was. And on that note, she called to her town to put that bravery to use. She explained that to disbelieve Helga is to put themselves at risk, and so she wanted to head to Pondside to see what has happened and to help. Mabel held up Cragflame in the air and called out her intention to adventure towards Pondside and do what she needed to do to preserve peace, asking all who could hear if they would join her on this quest. For a moment, there was only awkward glances and silence. But then Phineas the Rabbit Folk spoke up. He was one of the most talented archers that Goodhill had ever known, and he would truly be an asset on this mission. Next was Hug, a badger folk who stood towering above the others. And if Hugs was going, then Gev the lizard folk would need to follow so that he could keep him out of trouble. Then Zoraline, a bat folk, spread her wings and said that she believed Pondside would be a lodestar which would guide her to where she needed to be. And finally, Helga asked to join as well, saying that she wouldn't be too much help, but she did know a few cantrips which might come in handy at least. Altogether, that made a party of 6, and after saying goodbye to Mabel's family the next morning, they were ready to set off on this great adventure. Part 3. The Lost and the Found. That night, Helga slept poorly yet again. She couldn't stop thinking, would she arrive to villagers combing through debris or rebuilding homes? Would they be scraping together what food they had to make communal meals? Had she blown the terror and destruction of the Night Owl's attack out of proportion? Had she somehow underestimated the damage? And most worryingly, would she be thanked for finding help or hated for leaving them? Luckily, she was stopped from spiraling as Phineas asked her about herself. She told him all about being born in Three Tree City, how the pond had dried up and she moved with her family to the Willow, and how she eventually moved to Pondside with her grandparents when it became too crowded. Her grandparents had always encouraged her to follow her passions by studying art and magic, but to the rest of her family, Helga was just a disappointment. Phineas heard this and simply laughed, saying that some stems grow straight and others grow crooked, but they all taste fine in stew regardless. He then shifted topics to Helga's study of magic under King Glarb. However, this too was a harsh topic for her. While she was extremely talented with cantrips, she feared stories about the weave corrupting especially powerful mages, eventually turning them into mindless monsters, and so she had always been afraid to indulge too deeply into magic. Mabel then put an end to Phineas's questions, telling him to talk about himself rather than interrogate Helga. Phineas had apparently come from a long line of farmers, claiming that there was nothing really special or unique about him other than his skill with the bow. However, he wanted this journey as a chance to create a great story for his kids and grandkids when the time came. Then there was Gev and Hugs. While Hugs didn't talk too much, Gev spoke of their travels together with a skunk folk named Kiki. They had apparently journeyed to the Calamity graveyard together where they fought reanimated skeletal creatures which were constructed from Calamity Beast bones and the magic of squirrel folk necromancers. Luckily, Gev had been able to fend off the monsters by breathing a jet of fire to distract them as Hugs attacked from behind. Sensing a long story from Gev, Mabel asked him to scout ahead since he was the fastest, and after he left, Mabel explained that his stories might actually be too incredible to be true. Apparently, he and Hugs had experienced something awful on their adventures, and while Hugs dealt with it by keeping to himself, Gev tries to cope with stories. By midday, they had reached what remained of Pondside, a broken pile of shattered clay, charred wicker husks, crumbled chimneys, and splintered boards. The sight was so overwhelming that Helga's words completely failed her. Gev scurried to the top of what remained of a windmill and spotted the surviving villagers heading south towards a town called Haymeadow. However, he also saw squirrel folk digging through the rubble of Pondside. something which surprised Helga as none had lived there prior to the attack. Following Mabel, the group slowly made their way towards the squirrel folk to check things out, standing just far enough to overhear what they were talking about. These squirrels wore black cloaks fashioned with bones and leaf skirts, and discussed how the owl had made a mess of this place as well, just as it had the last one. And with those words, Helga shuddered. Her visions had been real, and the night owl had already attacked several towns, not just hers. The hooded squirrel continued. They asked why Cruelclaw was wasting their time combing through rubble, adding that they should hurry to Three Tree City to catch up with the others. But as Helga watched these two dig through the village's keepsakes and their belongings before discarding them as garbage, she became completely enraged, enough to stand up and scold them for stealing from those who had lost everything. While at first this seemed like an easy fight to pick, the squirrel folk evened the odds by spreading magic across the area, raising an army of skeletons from those who had died in Pondside and turning them into their own personal army. However, our heroes were not to be underestimated. Mabel, in a flash, managed to slice the head of one of the soldiers. Phineas followed suit, letting loose a pair of arrows that sunk into the eyes of a flying skeleton. Gev spun his fire mace and knocked another away. Hugs simply lifted the fourth skeleton and ripped him in half. And Zoraline siphoned magic from the necromancers and redirected it at their soldiers. Even Helga had a chance to show her worth as she created floating steps for Mabel to use as she climbed into the air to fight. However, because her focus was split, the spell faltered for a moment and the solid step turned back into liquid beneath Mabel's feet for a moment. It was only due to her quick reflexes that Mabel was able to maintain composure and continue her efforts. The battle was a quick one, but just as fast as the army had been summoned, the necromancers were defeated and forced to flee from the scene. While it was a moment of triumph for everyone else, Helga couldn't help but feel shame about losing control of her spell. But for as big a deal as she was making about it, Mabel simply shook it off as nothing serious, saying that they should focus on their next move rather than obsessing over small mishaps. Going forward, Helga decided to chase after the necromancers as she believed the other villagers would likely be safe at Haymeadow. Before leaving, everyone took some time to collect themselves. Phineas salvaged whatever arrows he could, Bev cleared shards of bones from Hugs's boots, and Zoraline hung upside down from Hugs's back as she took another nap. But Helga returned back to her home to see what remained of it. Like the rest of the village, it was left in ruins. Inside, she found some clean clothes and some food for their journey, but as she packed them, she couldn't help but feel like this was the last time she would see this place again. As such, she gathered one of her grandmother's etched copper orbs, as well as her grandfather's wand and hat. With these preparations complete, our heroes were ready to head north towards Three Tree City. When the next morning came, the party crossed paths with a group of otter folk who offered them a ride in their fish-shaped boat. It wouldn't be long as they continued down the river until three great trees became visible in the distance, an oak, a willow, and a sycamore. Finally, they landed at the dock and it was complete chaos. Animal folk were busy in the streets, bird folk flying by delivering packages, frog folk playing bubble ball. Anywhere our party looked, there was action to be witnessed. Phineas in particular struggled with this, as the sights and sounds were overwhelming for the rabbit who had come from such a small village. Helga broke him from his panic by asking for his help in seeking out information on the necromancers and on Cruelclaw. However, despite their efforts, they had very little luck finding anything. But they were not the only ones searching for someone. Nearby, an otterfolk with black fur and a white streak running through it was causing a commotion as he searched for someone wearing a blue cloak and having tattoos. Unfortunately, he too was struggling in his search. After all, he didn't know what kind of animal he was even looking for, and the people of Bloomburrow had no idea what tattoos were. However, as the otter continued to describe the person he was looking for, Helga had a sudden realization. She held up her journal to him, flipped to an old drawing, and found an image that matched the description he was giving. As the otter saw the image, he grabbed Helga by the arms and asked, "Did Beleren pass through here? How long ago, and was he with anyone?" His excitement was overwhelming, so much so that Mabel felt the need to threaten the otter, saying to release her friend or he would lose his arm. The otter obliged and finally gave his name. He was Ral Zarek, and he was searching for someone named Jace Beleren. Helga explained that this Jace she had seen in her vision was a fox folk, and he was most certainly not alone, traveling with some kind of lizard folk and another creature which was too difficult to make out, adding that there was a dark cloud which seemed to follow them wherever they went. Realizing that this conversation was only beneficial to the stranger and not for their own party, Mabel tried to end it by leading Helga away, but Ral refused to allow them to leave as Helga was his only link to Jace. Notably though, Helga herself was simply in awe that someone actually believed her visions. The conversation would have to wait though as a swarm of animals began rushing past them. Down at the river, the water was swelling up over the docks, and emerging from it was a gigantic silver fish with magical markings that seemed to lift the waves alongside themselves. It wouldn't be more than a second before Helga realized that this monstrosity was the Floodgar, yet another Calamity Beast. Ral prepared to send lightning at the fish to fend it off, however Mabel stopped him and warns that he will shock any other animal in the water as well. The Floodgar then sent a whip of water lashing across the city and knocking Mabel and Ral into hugs. The Badger folk did all he could to remain upright as he held on to his friends for dear life in all the chaos. However, despite his best efforts, a larger wave was coming and it completely swept the party into a tributary far out into the ice-cold water. Mabel asked Ral to redirect the currents, but he pressed back, saying that he could only control the rain, not the rivers. And this is something that stood out as strange to Mabel, as she had never come across an otterfolk who couldn't manage the currents. Eventually, the water did subside though, and through the entirety of this ordeal, Hugs had held on to the group with all of his might. But now he was completely exhausted, and at the first opportunity to loosen his grip, he collapsed onto the floor. The party had been pushed into a marshy cave down the river, and while their pride was hurt and their stomachs were full of water which had accidentally been swallowed, they were at least all in one piece and could begin to gather their composure. However, they quickly discovered that they were not alone. Moments later, a group of hooded ratfolk emerged from the shadows wielding curved daggers and demanding that the outsiders remove themselves. Part 4. Soothsaying and Stormcalling. Mabel did her best to explain to the ratfolk that they obviously didn't arrive here of their own accord, but they simply wouldn't listen and demanded that the heroes leave. While Mabel continues to de-escalate, Hugs, Gevs, Phineas, and Ral are more than ready for a fight though. Luckily, an elder rat with a shell-adorned cloak spoke up at the last moment and said that because these strangers had been brought by the river, they were to be treated with hospitality. And just like that, suddenly, these would-be enemies stick their paws out to help our party to their feet. The elder, whose name was Coffee, offered to give Mabel and the others a place to rest and eat before sending them on their way, even adding that the ratfolk might be able to help them on their quest. Mabel, of course, took Coffee up on this offer, and together our group follows behind the old ratfolk through a maze of limestone leading deeper underground. Occasionally, they'd come across side tunnels and tiny rooms with barren beds, and Coffee would explain that this place was their village, which had been built upon ancient burrows created by enormous insects from ages past. He'd continue saying that the people here were lore keepers who aimed to preserve the history of Bloomburrow. As they progressed deeper, they eventually found themselves in a spacious but comfortable room. Inside, Coffee apologized for the hostile greeting and told the party that they just recently had another group of strangers arrive who had caused a commotion, all led by a weasel folk wearing a red coat and wielding a rapier, unmistakably Cruel Claw. Coffee said that Cruel Claw had been leading his group of mercenaries through the wake of the Night Owl so that they could scavenge treasures from the towns that the Calamity Beasts destroyed. Helga exclaimed that they too were looking for Cruel Claw and had in fact just yesterday run into 2 of his necromancers. Mabel joined in to tell the rest of the story about how the Floodgar had caused them to wind up in this cave, but upon hearing of this second Calamity Beast's involvement, Coffee insisted that Cruel Claw needed to be stopped before more beasts got involved. Helga wondered to herself how anyone could cause the beast to act like this. After all, even the greatest weavers in history didn't possess that kind of power. But Coffee suggested that Cruel Claw must have stolen something which gave him, or whoever he worked for, the power to disrupt and manipulate the beasts, adding that one of his scouts saw a Calamity Beast egg in Cruel Claw's possession. Mabel declared that they must find the egg and return it to its rightful place, but Phineas leapt to his feet. He told her that he was just a simple farmer and that this quest was becoming far too dangerous. Ral simply laughed at the thought of an egg bringing an entire plane to ruin, but he told the group that they need not fear, for as long as Helga was his only link to Jace, he would vow to keep them all alive, even if that meant fighting an owl or a fish or whatever else. While some in the group were too concerned and Ral not concerned enough, Mabel spoke up about the responsibility that came with the knowledge of what was happening. If they didn't act to protect the valley, then what might become of their friends and families back home? Phineas conceded, but retorted, saying that even if they did want to pursue Cruelclaw, they had no way of finding him still. However, Mabel believed that Helga might be the answer to that problem. Helga was in utter shock. No one had ever believed in her visions in the past, let alone asked her for a specific premonition. Suddenly, she had the opportunity to be of use. So she poured a pitcher of water into a bowl before pulling out her journal. The most recent sketch had been of the Sunhawk, something that she had made just before the Night Owl's attack. But now she was turning to a blank page and began staring into the water. She calmed her mind, remained still, and gazed. But nothing happened. She couldn't help but be distracted by every little thing in the room, the shadows that were cast by the bookshelves, the smell of pleat and wet clothes, the twitching of ears and whiskers around her. Helga was failing, and this failure frustrated her to no end. She willed herself to try harder, but this only exacerbated the issue. And so Zoraline approached her and gave her words of encouragement, telling her that the light was already within her and that she didn't need to force it to glow. She only had to uncover it and allow it to shine. Hearing this, Helga finally allowed herself to get lost in her art, seemingly aimlessly drawing spirals, beads, and lines, until suddenly a three-tiered fountain revealed itself above a pond covered in lily pads. The frog simply stared at her work for a moment before declaring that they had gone to Fountainport, and hearing that, Mabel decided that so shall they. As proud as she was for having scryed successfully, Helga also stressed about the fact that she was returning to King Glarb's domain, the place that she had failed greater than any other in her life. But even with these thoughts in mind, the heroes could waste no time and immediately headed towards Fountainport. As they left, the Ratfolk offered directions to reach their destination. However, Hugs revealed that he knew a shortcut. Gev, on the other hand, was much less excited about this. Apparently, in trekking through the dandelion fields in the past, Hugs had gathered quite a few stickers in his fur that were a nightmare to pick out. More pressing than that, though, was rumors of danger along this route. Word had begun to circulate of an unknown beast that began prowling the area after a recent storm picked up. However, this was not a Calamity Beast, it was something else. For a moment, Ral hypothesized that this beast might be from another plane, but as he was the only one with knowledge of other planes, no one else really understood what he meant. Regardless, the group decided that being on the shortest path to their destination was more important than being on the safest path, and so they headed for the dandelion fields. This time, the journey would be filled with questions for Ral rather than Helga. Phineas asked the otter where he was from, and Ral simply responded, "Far away." When pushed and asked again if he meant the outer woods, Ral answered shortly that he was from even further than that. Phineas then asked if Ral had a family back home, and Ral began to softly talk about his husband, Tomik. Mabel approached and spoke about how much she missed her husband and her children, and a short moment of kinship developed between the two. Ral opened up, explaining that he missed Tomik quite a bit. However, he'd always been so focused on finding Jace that he never really had a chance to consider this feeling before, but now it was getting hard to ignore. They all continued talking until suddenly a massive shadow passed above them. Mabel reached for her sword. Ral tensed with sparkling lightning, and as they examined the beast, Ral's eyes shot open as he realized that whatever it was summoning a storm. In an instant, dark clouds started circling in the sky as if they were being sucked into a drain, and a giant creature showed itself in the air. It was large and purple. Its body crackled with lightning. It had 4 webbed wings with ends similar to batfolk's and feathers along its back. Its talons were large enough to even lift Hugs off the ground. Phineas was in absolute shock at the sight of the beast. He had never seen anything like it before, but Ral had. This was a dragon, albeit one which had been animal shifted in the same way that he had. Without hesitation, he warned the others, saying that this monster wasn't from Bloomburrow, but it was just as dangerous as their Calamity Beasts. He told them that they wouldn't stand a chance if they stayed to battle it here, and so their only chance was to sneakily make their way across the field and pray to avoid its eye. The group made great progress until disaster struck. A tuft of dandelion brushed across Zoraline's sleeping face and caused her to sneeze awake. A sound which, to the dread of everyone else, drew the attention of the Dragonhawk. The beast swooped down towards them, and with luck, they narrowly avoided it. With no options left anymore, Ral decided to try and fight back. Even if he couldn't kill it, he might be able to piss it off enough to leave them alone. He called out for a lightning rod, and Phineas quickly complied by wrapping some copper wire around one of his arrows and then shooting it right into the dragon's mouth, where it was lodged between the beast's teeth. The dragon came in for another attack, but this time on its rise back into the air, Ral summoned all of his power and called down a barrage of electricity which struck down on the dragon's head. As the lightning cleared, there was a moment of silence that filled the air, as no one knew if the dragon would retaliate or leave. And luckily, the beast opted to fly away and avoid another chance at coming face to face with lightning once more. During this fight, the rain had become so intense that the group had to find shelter. And so, Helga created a bubble for them which would keep them dry until the rain subsided. And once they did, they were all ready to head to Fountainport. Part 5. Nightfall in Fountainport. By the time they arrived, Helga was a nervous wreck filled with anxiety and shame over her failures in the city in the past. However, her allies were struck with wonder and admiration towards the sights of Fountainport, this massive, three-tiered city flowing with gorgeously clear water and bustling with people. The city was so large and intricate that even Mabel was unsure where to begin their search. And so Helga suggested that she might be able to get an audience with King Glarb, though, of course, she had to mention that there was no guarantee as they separated on pretty rough terms. Ral tried to assure her that things would be okay, but even so, Helga would guide her party through the scenic route towards the king to prolong things as much as possible. This, however, gave her plenty of time to think and to worry. What if the king didn't remember her? After all, he had so many apprentices. Or worse yet, what if the king did remember her due to her failure? She was so ensnared in thought that she didn't even realize that one of the king's attendants had approached them and asked if their party needed anything. Mabel shook Helga back to reality, and in a small voice, the frog folk asked for an audience with King Glarb. The attendant told her that the king was very busy this week, but Mabel interrupted and said that Helga was a former apprentice of the king, and that they must speak to him now as Calamity Beasts were wreaking havoc across the land. Hearing this, the attendant hopped towards the king to see if there was any way of getting them in quickly. While he was gone, Mabel finally asked Helga what she had done that was so bad. Helga explained that she had always struggled with being attentive, and that often caused problems. However, one time in particular was far worse than the others. While practicing water spout cantrips, Helga had accidentally knocked the king's staff out of his hands and off of one of the tiers of Fountainport. Thinking quickly, Helga tried to open a portal below the staff and another next to herself in hopes that it would fall through and she could catch it. However, the king also took action to save the staff. He had sent a water whip to reach out for it, but rather than catching it, the whip was transported through Helga's portal and launched back at his own face. She had not only lost the staff, but she had caused the king to hit himself with a spell so hard that it left him with a serious concussion. Helga was filled with dread over her past failures, but the others quickly stepped in to remind her of all the good that she has done. She had succeeded in keeping them dry from the rain with her cantrips, and in scrying for Cruel Claw's location. While she had been off to a rocky start, things definitely improved and she had become invaluable. Even hearing this, Helga couldn't help but think of her successes as being similar to the water step cantrip she cast earlier. Even if she succeeded for a few steps, all she was doing was setting up for a bigger fall when things fell apart. It was at this time that the aide returned and led the group back to the throne room to meet with King Glarb. Helga began telling the king about what had happened with Maha at her village, but he quickly interrupted her, saying that it was a tragedy, but unpredictable attacks like this are why they were in need of augurs. She would continue telling him about the other towns that the Night Owl had destroyed, and how the Floodgar had also attacked Three Tree City, and Mabel even jumped in to explain how Cruel Claw had stolen the Calamity Beast's egg to cause further attacks. However, Helga noticed something strange as she watched the king. His eyes scanned across the room and stared at a leaf screen set up in a dimly lit corner. As the king began to ask who else knew about this story, Helga began to sense a pulsing magic like a heartbeat behind the leaf. Mabel continued saying that if they could get a hold of the egg, they could return it to its rightful home, but the king simply shrugged and said that he had a different plan, adding that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Suddenly, dread filled Helga as she began to understand what was happening. She acted as quickly as she could, pulling down the leaf screen with a tendril of water to reveal a massive blue egg with specks that glittered like stars. The king explained how he had paid Cruel Claw to bring him the egg, and on cue, the weasel folk emerged from the shadows as well. Glarb boasted, saying that with the right weaving, he could control a beast with the egg. They would never have to worry about changing seasons, or droughts, or plagues. They could have their own champion to defend the animal folk of the valley. Hearing this, Helga erupted with anger. The king had caused so much damage, and she knew better than anyone that the Calamity Beasts were beyond controlling. Even if the king did succeed, it's likely that this weaving would overwhelm him and he'd become a mindless monster himself. Disgusted by the hero's willingness to oppose him, Glarb threatened to lock them away in a hole so deep that they would never be heard from again, demanding that Cruel Claw deal with these treasonous invaders. With a snap of Cruel Claw's fingers, a dozen mercenaries emerged from the shadows of the room as King Glarb wove watery bonds to ensnare Helga and her friends. In a panic, Mabel asked if Helga could free them with a spell, but Glarb simply laughed, saying that she was a failed weaver who had no chance of surpassing him. However, Mabel truly believed in Helga. She told her new friend that they could have never gotten this far if it had not been for her talents. And as Helga stared into Mabel's eyes, she found strength in the first person who had ever believed her. As Cruel Claw charged towards them to attack, Helga harnessed a small section of the watery bonds to flow under his feet and redirect him towards the king, a distraction which broke Glarb's concentration just long enough for the heroes to break free and retaliate. The group immediately took to their battle positions. Mabel drew Cragflame, Gev pulled out his fiery maces, Phineas readied arrows into his bow, Hugs stood there real intimidating like, and Helga created a shield of water, all before declaring that she would show the king what they were made of. Together they made short work of Cruel Claw's mercenaries, but it wouldn't be long before Cruel Claw himself approached Mabel. He threatened her, saying that the only way he would allow them to live was if they gave up right now, but Mabel had no intention of backing down. However, this was no fair fight. King Glarb opened a portal which shifted Mabel into a position where Cruel Claw could strike her with his poisoned blade. Mabel did all she could to fend off the attack, but with each passing moment, Cruel Claw's blade drew closer. She thought back to her family at home and knew that it couldn't end like this. A thought which reignited both her resolve and Cragflame, which burst into flame in response to her passion. The blade's fire singed Cruel Claw's fur and opened him up for an attack in which Mabel completely disarmed him. It was Mabel's turn for an ultimatum, telling him to leave now and make better choices with his life. But as Cruel Claw responded, the king simply laughed again. He had encased Helga in a massive block of ice, believing that this would ensure his victory. All this did, though, was redouble Mabel's resolve. She charged towards the king with unbelievable speed, and for a moment, Glarb could swear that the fire coming from her sword took the shape of a massive wolf coming in to attack him. Glarb would need to release Helga from his spell so that he could raise himself up on a platform of water to avoid the incoming strike. But as he did, black clouds began to swell above him and his castle. Ral called out to Mabel, telling her that the Dragon Hawk had returned, and it immediately dove towards King Glarb and forced him to portal away to safety. Mabel turned to Ral to see if he could strike the beast with lightning again, but in a city that is entirely covered in water, he would likely kill half the residents if he did. So instead, he focused on trying to calm the storm. While he did, Mabel would need a plan, and this time she turned to Helga. She had her create water steps once more and hoped to lure in the Dragon Hawk with the light coming from Cragflame. It would only be a moment before the dragon found its new prey and once again took a plunge, this time towards Mabel. However, halfway to its destination, the Dragon Hawk would be struck and pushed off course. Maha, the night owl, had arrived, and the storm above was swallowed by a dark, starry sky. No matter how hard the dragon tried, the owl completely overwhelmed its every effort to fight back, and ultimately the beast was forced to flee once more. The threat gone, Maha perched within the throne room and began to stare at Mabel. An unspoken conversation took place between the two of them, and the mouse folk immediately understood what the beast wanted. She scurried off and grabbed the egg which had been stolen and presented it to the Calamity Beast waiting before her. With the egg safely in Maha's possession, the beast's eyes softened and she peacefully flew away without causing any more harm. And with that, their quest had been completed. City officials began to search for Cruelclaw and King Glarb to take them into custody, and everyone else would return back to Goodhill where they could celebrate their success. They'd be met with a hero's welcome as everyone lined the streets and cheered for them, and of course Mabel would be happiest of all as she was finally reunited with her family. That said, Goodhill would also become Helga's home as she decided to stay and become a hedge witch here. As for Ral, he decided that even if Jace was on Bloomburrow, it was still best for him to return to his own world where he could warn everyone else of the dragon jumping between planes. However, not all would come to a clean ending. Helga once again received a vision, but this time it was much different. Her eyes began to glow as an ominous voice spoke through her, saying, "The kings in the dark shall return. The mage in blue shall bring about the end." Hearing this, Ral was filled with even more questions, but all the same, it was time for him to return home. These were answers he would have to find on another day. With that, he planeswalked back to Tomek, and the animal folk returned to their party, knowing that the Calamity Beasts rampage had come to an end.